Welcome to our webinar about the quarterly EU economic update, a rocky road to the recovery, in which we will explore if the Recovery and Resilience Fund will be the game changer that the EU economy needs. This event is organized by the European American Chamber of Commerce with the support of the European Commission. My name is Yvonne Bendinger-Rothschild. I'm the Executive Director of the EACC New York, and I will be your host for today's event. To make this program interactive, please submit questions. We will feed them into the conversation as we go along. In today's webinar, we will discuss the recent economic data and policy developments through the mid-October report, economic forecast, and the prospects for the European and global growth against a range of remaining risk factors. Our panel of experts includes Balázs Pakányi. He's the Counselor for Economic and Financial Affairs at the EU delegation to the United States. He's based in Washington. And Balázs monitors US economic and economic policy developments. And he's in charge of transatlantic economic relations and relations between the EU and multilateral financial institutions such as the IMF. Prior to joining the delegation, Balázs held various positions in the European Commission Directorate General of Economic and Financial Affairs. We're also joined by Ben Cowliner. He's a senior economist at the EU delegation to the US, and Ben focuses on US macroeconomics with a special emphasis on the US monetary and fiscal policies, transatlantic economic relation, and the financial markets. Prior to joining the delegation, Ben worked at the Economic Strategy Institute, a think tank in Washington, D.C., where he was the director of research. Balázs, let's get started with you. So there's a lot of momentum on the recovery. We see growth numbers on the EU economy, also in the US, and high vaccination rates. Public policy seems to be paying dividends. What do you see from the report that was just published?
Thanks, Yvonne, and thanks for having us for this presentation. Yes, as you just mentioned, the latest forecast from the European Commission has come out just less than a week ago, last week, and in that forecast, you will see that actually the economy of the European economy is doing quite well. There's a quite robust forecast going forward. And actually, the data that has come in lately, the second quarter, especially, and also the third quarter data, was very positive. So, given the discussion that we are having in these days, whether the recovery is slowing down and all that, what I would like to highlight, perhaps, as for us to start this discussion, is that this is a revision upwards for the forecast. So there were plenty of positive news coming out these days. So if you can perhaps go to the next slide, which just lays out at the beginning the key messages of the forecast, and we will of course go into more details as we go along. So as I was saying, the forecast for the GDP for the economic activity is pretty good for the euro area and also for the EU. For this year, we have 5% growth, and this will only moderate slightly for next year for 4.3%, which is not too dissimilar to the forecast to the US, I would say. Of course, there are headwinds that we are facing in Europe. This is also similar to what we see elsewhere in the world. For example, disruptions in global logistics, shortages of raw intermediate inputs, and so on. But the second message I would say is maybe on the labor market, where we have also seen good news coming in. The labor market has been improving. This will obviously provide extra income for the households, which can then spend that extra income, which would support also the growth going forward. In addition, we will have the EU instrument, which is called the Recovery and Resilience Fund, which we also have in the title. which will provide financing for both household and corporate spending. So given these factors, the labor market has actually recovered. So what you would see in the forecast, they didn't have the third quarter data yet, but in the latest third quarter GDP figures, we've seen that the labor market has more or less come back to the to pre-crisis levels. And this is also true for the GDP. We will go into more details. Perhaps the third main message would be about inflation. We are having this discussion also in the US, where basically with the high demand coming out of the pandemic and the supply chain shortages have raised inflation. But we believe, and the Commission forecast is putting forward numbers that this inflation would eventually come back down. The fourth point that is worth mentioning is that of course public finances have been impacted by the crisis because of the various support measures that were given to both households and corporations. But this, as these measures are phased out gradually, the higher deficit numbers that we're seeing in Europe will also gradually decrease.
If I may jump in here for a second, they had a really interesting story in the New York Times this morning about exactly that issue. That unlike the last recession in 2008. That this time around, on both sides, in Europe and in the US, government was pumping money into the economy much more forcefully. And the argument in the article that was made in the article was, if you have people out of jobs, they're not paying income tax. If you have people who don't have enough money because they don't have a job, they don't pay sales tax. And if you don't have companies who are producing things, they don't pay corporate taxes. And if you don't have any wins in the economy, they're not paying capital gains taxes. So we have the same situation in the US by avoiding all of that with the stimulus in the US and in Europe. And now all of a sudden these states and the governments in Europe are facing a situation where they have more money than they had anticipated. Do you want to go a little bit into that when we're looking at the first slide where you're talking about the real GDP growth path in Europe? Because I thought that it was a really interesting slide, and I would love to hear how you said we revised the forecast upwards. Do you want to go a little bit into detail on that?
So yeah, why don't we go to the next slide then, and then that will show more in more details what I was just mentioning. So yes, you're right. So so this slide, what it shows is that how the European Commission has revised its forecast as we went along from the pandemic. So what you will see is the sort of the gray line on top was the forecast before the pandemic. So this is sort of the counterfactual, if you will. And then you will see all the different whiskers that the different vintages of the forecast. And what I would like to highlight in this one is that as not so far in the past, spring 2021, we have expected that the European economy would recover back to the 100%, so before pandemic levels, only by the end of this year. Whereas now, with the positive data coming in, the new forecast is actually predicting that we're going to be back 1 quarter earlier. And the latest data release only yesterday has actually confirmed that number. So we are now closed the gap that was opened up by the crisis. And similar to what's happening in the US, we have actually now we continue to grow beyond the pre-pandemic levels. And if you, the other point I would like to note on this slide is that that we're also closing the gap vis-a-vis the trend that used to be before the crisis. So that's the gray line, and that gap is going to be closed within about 1 year time. So of course this is all subject to say the supply shortages, as you mentioned, is subject to the fiscal measures being withdrawn, as you just have mentioned, and infection rates and all that. But I think it's a very positive message that that we're not only back to the pre-crisis level, but within 1 year time we will be back to the pre-crisis trend. So I think that's. I mean, this is one slide. If you have any questions, I can go into more detail, but perhaps we can also jump to the next slide, which is the comparison with the US. And as I was saying, it seems that the European economy has sort of caught up with the US economy. So in the first part of the year, we were thinking about how come that the US economy is growing so much faster. They have rebounded so much faster than the European economy, and the European economy has looked as if it was more sluggish in coming back from the crisis. And this chart will show that this is, by the way, quarter figures. So this means how much the economy has grown compared to the previous 3 months, previous quarter. So this is important to highlight because these are actually huge numbers. So if you look at, for example, the Q2 figure, which is it's kind of small to see, but it was, I think, about 2.1% growth. That actually translates into something like 14% year on year compared to the previous year's same quarter figure. So this is huge growth numbers, the kind of growth numbers that you would see like 10 years ago in China. And I understand that this is because we're coming out of a big slump. We're coming from the base effects out there, but yet I just want to highlight that these are huge numbers. If you want to analyze them, you would have to multiply these numbers by 4. And what this chart is showing you is that in the last 2 quarters, the second quarter and the third quarter of 2021, basically the European economy was able to close the gap with the US. So whereas the US was performing better in the first half of the year, the European economy has managed to catch up. I think this is very good news for this one.
Where do you think the differences come from? And as a second question, how do you think we can improve upon that development? Or what can be done? What else can be done to to improve on these developments on both sides of the Atlantic?
Yeah, so I think one important issue is vaccination. So obviously the pandemic has had an impact on economic and social impact and health impact, obviously, and which was more, I think, it was more restrictive in Europe in the first half of the year than it was in the US. So perhaps the rollout of the vaccination was a little bit faster in the US. We are very good, standing at the good levels in Europe, I must say. So we have now surpassed in terms of vaccination rates what the US have. And of course, there's also differences across within the EU, across countries. So you would have a bigger impact at the beginning of the year because of the lockdown measures on sectors which are need contact-based sectors, and those services, for example, and hospitality sector. Those would have been more impacted perhaps in Europe than in the US. And what can we do about it? Obviously, raising vaccination rates would be not only in Europe and the US, but worldwide, globally. It would be very important to get people back into their jobs, to be able to alleviate a little bit the supply shortages, which is hitting. Some of these products are coming from manufacturing countries which are in developing countries, right, where the vaccination rates are much lower. So I think this could be one overarching policy that would help both developing countries, the US and the EU alike.
If I could jump in quickly, I think, first of all, policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic, I think, deserve a lot of credit for acting forcefully and doing a lot to cushion the harmful economic impacts. I mean, look at this chart right here, Q2 in 2020, most countries recorded the sharpest, worst economic performance, in history, certainly since World War II. And to see us already being back at pre-pandemic GDP levels is a pretty notable accomplishment. Now, as for the differences, I think you guys have touched on this already, but it's true that the specific waves of COVID infections didn't hit in quite the same times in Europe and the United States. And there were differences in the containment measures that were enacted in various countries and various states in the US for that matter. But I think it's also worth highlighting that the challenges that policymakers faced were similar, but they weren't exactly the same, right? Because in the United States, one of the key things that emerged from the initial impact of the pandemic was the fact that the US social safety net wasn't really fit for purpose. It needed policymakers needed to improvise to come up with the Paycheck Protection Program and to extend unemployment benefits to gig workers, for example, things like this. Whereas in Europe, most EU member states already had short-time work schemes that were in place that could be rolled out, that were already working pretty smoothly. And whereas in Europe, the challenge was to prevent the kind of divergence that we saw during the global financial crisis 10 years ago. And in Europe, the response in terms of doing it on the EU level and promoting greater harmony and building the toolkit of the European Union through things like SURE, this program that backstops the short work schemes in European member states, as well as the RRF, have been, that's where the weaknesses were in Europe. And so policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic moved to shore up the weaknesses in their system. And I think, the numbers pretty much speak for themselves. They've done quite a good job.
Yeah, I would like to go to the next slide and talk a little bit, in the vein of what you just said, talk a little bit about what drove that growth. Is it consumer spending? Is it corporate spending? Where is this? Is it, public spending? Where is this coming from?
Yes, I think that is a very informative slide, and I think that helps us to sort of spell out the story, the narrative for the entire forecast. So you will see. I mean, maybe it's a lot of things stacked up in each other. But if you look at the light blue, not like a medium blue bars, that's private consumption. So if you see in 2020, for the containment measures, everybody stayed at home. Nobody was able to consume that much as previously. So there was a huge drop that was led by the private consumption. Now in 2021, we have some of the containment measures were lifted, so people were able to go out and have a dinner at a restaurant or have haircuts or whatever. So that sort of pent-up demand has rebounded, that has come back forcefully. But you will see that going forward beyond this year, it's that medium blue bar that's going to be driving the forecast. So that's the hugest part, the largest part in 2022 and 23. So whereas this year you see that 10, or I know like light orange kind of part, which is government consumption in 2021. Yes, that shows that the measures, that the policy measures that were enacted for supporting households and corporations during the pandemic had a large impact on the economy rebounding. But going forward, that little 10 is getting smaller and smaller, or maybe even disappears. So that means that it's not it's not the fiscal measures that drive the forecast, the robust growth going forward, but it's rather private consumption. And it's not only containment measures being lifted, it's also the labor market doing well. People are going back to their jobs, they're getting back their incomes. So actually, in that respect, the measures that Ben has just mentioned, all the income support measures, they work just fine. That before people could get back to jobs, they could maintain their income levels, but going forward, they can switch it back again to their regular income. And that's, I think, is important. And then just perhaps one more thing to mention on this slide is the investments. So that's basically how corporations see their future, whether they have sufficient confidence in investing in working capital going forward. And you will see that there's also quite a, it's always a smaller, in any forecast you will see that the investment part is much more smaller than the private consumption part. So it's no surprise there that that part is a bit smaller, but it's very, very consistently, it's a good size and it's consistent over the forecast. And
what I think is interesting is that private consumption is picking up that much of the slack in Europe, because in the past it was not the case. It was more the case that consumers were much more reluctant in comparison to how this same graph would look like in the US.
Well, the last time we did one of these events, Yvonne, we were talking about how once we reopened, it was going to be like the roaring 20s, because people were going to be so excited to get out of their house, go shopping and go to restaurants and stuff. And maybe making the analogy to the roaring 20s was a bit too optimistic, because we are still dealing with ongoing infections and things like, but it's true. People are feeling better. People are feeling optimistic, and that's a good sign.
Yeah, for sure. Bankruptcies, how are they? In the vein of this, how are these looking in across the EU, and maybe if you can talk a little bit about how that versus how it looks in the EU versus the US.
Well, bankruptcies have been surprisingly low, much lower than people. I mean, a year ago, people were worried that, oh man, when we come out of this, there's just going to be, devastation. Particularly small businesses are going to go under in droves. And what is this going to mean for the labor market? Is there going to be permanent scarring where businesses disappear? People aren't going to be able to go find jobs and go back to work. And that has not happened. Bankruptcy rates remain lower than normal, lower than during typical expansions or downturns, and that is also fed through into very low non-performing loan rates on the books of major European banks. I think it's also worth highlighting that there have, in contrast to the global financial crisis, which was, in fairness, was a financial crisis, but you have not seen. It's not just that you haven't seen any bank failures. You haven't seen major European banks need to raise capital. They're well capitalized. The regulatory environment seems to have done a good job of preparing major financial institutions for the type of disruptions that we saw. And obviously we will have to see how things move ahead going forward. But the outlook is for corporate profits to be improving in Europe, largely on the basis of all this domestic demand, people going out and buying stuff. And when that happens, companies can make money and they increase revenues and hopefully increase their earnings. So the outlook in terms of corporate profits, corporate earnings is pretty good.
Yeah, I see the same here in the US. The people that we're talking to, they're all saying we have, we are going to invest. US companies and European companies here in the US. Can we, just to stay with this for a little bit longer, so how, we talked about consumer spending. Let's talk a little bit in what sectors are going to be better off than some of the others. Did the report say anything about that?
Well, the report has discussed this a little bit, maybe not as much in detail as it would have been worth while. But what I can say is that where does the economic activity come back to? Which sectors? If I translate your question a little bit in this direction, then what we have seen is that obviously for the health concerns, services and content-based sectors have shrunk quite significantly last year. They haven't come back just as much early this year. They have started to come back during the summer in Europe because of the good COVID results and because of the lifting of the containment measures. But at the same time, construction sector has kept up. So construction sector was going quite well at the beginning of the year, and what we're seeing is that this is sort of rotates. Now it's as if it would switch. So people, as they are getting vaccinated and they are more inclined to go out and consume services, that sector is coming back even more or rebounding even more. Whereas construction is constrained a little bit by the supply shortages like cement and other raw materials that you need for construction. So what we're seeing is that perhaps that while demand is being robust going forward, and you can expect that there's a solid contribution to growth, but there's a rotational shift in the sectors that will produce that will be meeting the demand.
Yeah, we have a slide about employment, the labor market, but do we want to stay a little bit on supply chain issues and production of raw materials, microprocessors, because that's also slowing down. I mean, you have companies who want to invest, but yet they can't make more cars because they don't have the microprocessors. How is that factored into the predictions?
Well, maybe we have a slide on this too. Actually, maybe we could move to the 8th slide, and just to show you a little thing on the right-hand side, what you're seeing is survey data from factory managers in Europe, and what stands out is that these shortages of material and equipment are the main factor that's limiting production right now. You have some pockets of labor shortages that are emerging in a couple of places, but really this is a story of supply chains that are struggling to keep up with demand and that are facing a variety of bottlenecks and supply shortages across sectors. So as you said, this is everything from raw materials to microchips, and on the one hand, it's a function of having these global supply chains where, as COVID infections hit different parts of the world, there's containment measures that are put in place in certain parts of Asia or certain parts of Europe, and this slows things down. But it's also worth talking a little bit about raw materials, because there's been a big surge in energy prices, and particularly in Europe, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in some of the upcoming slides. But I think that the main thing to point out here is that this isn't just an inflation story. I think a lot of times when you read in the news, you read about supply chain shortages flowing through in terms of higher prices, pushing inflation up, and whether or not inflation is going to be transitory. Now, these are important, but in this context, what we're talking about is that this is actually limiting output. So vehicle production in Europe has been down a lot because a lot of factories simply can't source the inputs that they need, particularly microchips, in order to get cars out of the factory and into showrooms. So again, though, this is likely to be temporary, and partly it's going to be met with companies investing more and building up new capacity. That takes a little bit longer, but I think that you're going to see these things working through quite quickly, especially by, I'd say, the second half of next year. I think my expectation is that a lot of these supply shortages at least are going to be resolved.
Yeah, I see that the labor line is taking a little bit of a dent back downwards. Is that related to wage increases, or?
You haven't seen as big wage increases in Europe as you have in the United States, but maybe we should go back to the previous slide on labor markets so we can talk a little bit about what's going on there.
Yeah. I think
I can take this one too. So I think this slide shows what was penciled into the forecast. So so you will see that that basically. Let me first try to talk a little bit about the right-hand side slide or chart on unemployment rate. So you can see that we're almost back to the level where we were before the pandemic, and mind that it's also sort of a low point in unemployment before the pandemic. You see that it was coming down from above 10% to 6.7. So we are heading back to where we were before the pandemic in terms of unemployment. Of course, unemployment in the current situation, unemployment rate, it might not be the best measure to describe the labor market, because you could have people who are not really looking forward going back to the market, to labor market anymore. Maybe some pensioners have taken out early pension or whatever. So maybe the unemployment measure is not the best one to look at, but but nevertheless, I think I just wanted to highlight that we're getting back to a situation where we used to be before the pandemic. So let's look at the employment rather, because that's maybe more telling in terms of what the situation is. And you can see that the sort of the reddish bars hanging down are the sort of the shortfall compared to the shortfall compared to the pre-crisis levels in terms of employment numbers. And actually, we have just yesterday came out the new GDP numbers, and with that, the Q3 figure for employment, which shows that we are actually back to where we were in 2019 Q4. So surprising again that we have thought that the recovery in the labor market would be lagging more the recovery in the GDP, and GDP has recovered faster than we thought, and actually labor market has recovered faster than we thought. So I think these are very positive news that we're getting from the data, that already in terms of the number of people employed, we are back to pre-crisis levels. And what you will, so just want to throw out one.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to throw out one number. Like in 2021 Q2 this year, there were 1.5 million jobs added in the EU. So I think that's quite an impressive number.
Yeah, it is. It's the same here. Everybody's hiring. I mean, every store, everyone. You see for hire signs on every corner. It's really quite incredible. I think that the issue is still going to be, how do you bring people back to work, the whole return to work environment, how you organize that. Daycare and the schools stayed open mostly in Europe. Here, a lot of them closed. And there was online learning, which obviously requires a parent to be at home. So that is still, I think there's still some, room for uncertainty in that space, where we don't know exactly how it's going to develop.
Just to add that, Europe never experienced the huge spike in unemployment that the United States did, in large part because these short-time work schemes kept people attached to their jobs and subsidized their incomes. And so, but if you look at the blue bars there on the left chart, that's the number of hours worked. If you measure the number of hours worked in the US and Europe, both sides of the Atlantic suffered a broadly similar decline in the number of hours worked. And then as the recovery started happening again, people started working more and more, and in the United States, companies started rehiring people very rapidly. But in Europe, they still had a job. They never lost it in the first place. So that's an example of one of these policy measures working.
Yeah, we can't have this conversation without having a conversation about inflation. So I think we have a slide for that.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go to the 9th slide, or yeah, the 9th slide. So just right. So we talked a little bit more. We talked a little bit about the headwinds on output that supply chains were causing, and they are also causing a bit of an increase in inflation. But I think the main thing that we'd like to emphasize is that inflation, higher inflation, is supposed to be temporary. It should prove transient. Headline HICP inflation, which is the main European measure, rose at an annual pace of 2.8% in the third quarter, which was a pretty big move back up from the 0.3% that was recorded in Q4 2020. But actually, if you look at it on the monthly numbers, there's been an even higher spike. So headline HICP hit 4.1% in October, which is a 10-year high. And, you know, it's a cause for concern. But the fact is that the majority of price increases are linked to, on the one hand, these supply shortages, and on the other hand, higher energy prices. So if you look at core inflation that strips out food and energy, core HICP inflation was just up 2.1% in October. And the higher energy prices and the supply shortages, okay, we don't know exactly when they're going to ease, but they are expected to be temporary because they're a function of you know, the troubles in reopening and some of the, you know, temporary glitches that are affecting people. So the Commission is forecasting that headline inflation for the EU as a whole is going to hit about 2.6% this year. You're probably still going to see some price increases in the first half of next year. So for 2022, the forecast is for 2.5%. But then by 23, we should have worked through most of these issues. And the forecast is for inflation to fall back to 1.6% at an annual rate. So on the right, on the chart on the right, you can see why we're sanguine, because if you look at futures prices for natural gas, the markets expect that natural gas and electricity prices are going to peak in the winter, and then they're going to fall back quite rapidly. And, you know, in Europe, energy markets, there's some peculiarities to global energy markets that these higher prices have affected Europe a bit more than some other places. One is that there's a shortage of Russian natural gas supplies into Europe, and these are, you know, partly geopolitical reasons. But you also have just the way the electricity market works. You know, renewables can't provide all the baseline power, and natural gas generating plants are one of the main providers of electricity for, you know, a lot of European consumers. And so when you have higher natural gas prices, that quickly translates into higher electricity prices as well. This can have an impact on production, and it feeds through into inflation. It does so a little bit differently depending on the country because of whether or not consumers' electricity bills are tied to long-term or short-term supply contracts and things like that. But it's going to have an impact. It's going to be temporary. It's going to start to ease back, hopefully by the spring.
Even with the disruptions that around the Nord Stream pipeline, because that's back in the news.
I think so, yeah. I mean, obviously geopolitics is a wild card and we can't know exactly what's going to happen, but I think, you know, futures prices are a pretty good indication of what a lot of people who have skin in the game, who have money in the game, think is going to happen. So obviously there's a risk and there's some uncertainty about what's going to happen, but this is the expectation. And I think it's also worth emphasizing for this audience, if we can go to the next slide, that the inflation spike in the US has been much more severe than what we've seen in Europe. So there you can see the blue line, you know, core, this is core inflation. So core PCE inflation in the US was running at 3.6% in October. We're, you know, nowhere near that. We were at 2.1 in Europe. And even if we're going to see a few months of higher energy prices, ongoing supply chain issues that feed into inflation, I think it should prove transient. I'm definitely on team transient, and I do mean that in the sense that Chair Powell means it, which doesn't mean that price increases are going to be brief, but rather that they're not going to be permanent, that they're related to these difficulties in reopening, and that once these get sorted out, they're going to go away. So eventually, businesses are going to sort out their supply chain issues. Balazs already talked a bit about how consumer demand is shifting from durable goods, where, you know, when everyone was locked up at home, they decided that they needed new computers to, you know, hold webinars from their home office. Maybe they needed some new furniture. Maybe they needed to add on a room on the back so that their kids could study in peace and quiet. There was a lot of buying stuff, buying goods. But as people shift back to consuming more in-person services, some of the demand for durable goods is going to ease, and hence pricing pressures should ease as well. Anyway, that's why we're sanguine.
So this inflation issue, just to stick with that for a minute. So there are two factors going into that. One is energy prices, and the other one is the supply chain. And not only supply chain, but also I think the biggest factor is also that logistics costs have gone up fivefold, if I'm not mistaken. Let's stick for a minute on the energy prices. We have in the US, we have the infrastructure plan. In Europe, we have the Green Deal and digital transition. How is the Green Deal going to be affected by the increase in energy prices? Are people going to invest more into green energy or less?
Yeah, so I think, yes, Yvonne, so I think it's a very good question. I think usually the question even starts perhaps one step beforehand, and Ben, I think, explained that whether the you know, increasing carbon prices in Europe has led to the increase in energy prices. This is not the case. So that I think it's important to highlight that it's you know, the causality is not really there. So when you think about energy prices, it has to do with all those reasons that Ben has explained. And then the second question that usually arises from this, what has you just mentioned, like what does the higher energy prices mean for the green transition and all the investments that would go into that new technology? Because the argument might you know, go that if you have higher energy prices, then if governments are reluctant to let consumers actually you know, pay the higher prices, and they do some kind of a scheme, then basically the higher energy prices would not force consumers to switch away from dirty energy or you know, old energy. They would not be forced to switch to green energy. But I think that argument doesn't really hold. The reason is that the transition, the green transition, will take place in Europe. We have a Fit for 55 package. We have each member state presenting their plans in the Recovery and Resilience Plan. Which contains 37% of that money that they're receiving to be spent on green energy. So the transition will take place, and therefore the calculus that you know, the sort of the investment, the profitability of the investment that you would need to do for that green transition, the calculus of that investment will not change. So I think that just because they have a spike in energy prices, which will be transitory, as Ben has explained, doesn't mean that the calculus for the green investments, which are anyway like you know, 10, 15 years long transition, so it's not for 1 year, the calculus for that those investments will not change. So I think both governments and the corporations will continue to invest in those technologies.
We have a question from the audience that is related to that. On the West Coast, and they had a story in the news the other day as well about this. There's a big push in California for a green transition. Turns out half of the solar panels can't be installed because of the shortage of electricians. And apparently, this is how is this, the skill mismatch? Is there a big? Is this going to be a big issue for the digital transition or the green transition in the EU? Or is this, and can the EU work with the US to fix it, to implement some of the green transitions in the US economy?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it brings up sort of a number of related issues. So, I mean, one thing I would say is that, everywhere, but especially in Europe, the thinking behind the green transition is, I mean, yes, it will have costs, and there will be, coal industries are getting phased out, and what's going to happen to those workers, it's going to be difficult for some people. But the thinking is that the green transition, if it's going to be successful, has to be pro-growth, and it has to involve creating new jobs, new industries, new businesses, and that's a lot of where the thinking is going. And this is why the Recovery and Resilience Fund places such emphasis on the green transition. 37% of all RRF funding has to go towards climate-related investments, and in particular, we're talking about electric vehicles and putting the infrastructure in place, like having charging stations attached to everywhere on parking meters and in people's homes and in parking garages and stuff like that. So there's going to be a lot of money thrown into areas like that. And I mean, just talking about the electric vehicles in Europe, electric vehicles last month or last quarter, I forget, is already over 20% of all vehicle sales in Europe. Now, to be honest, part of the reason is because auto sales have been constrained because of these chip shortages. So it's 20% of a slightly lower pie. It's making it sound even better than it is. But that's up from 10% already in 2020. And this transition is happening. And then there's this question that you raised about having enough electricians to install the solar panels. When you're talking about the scale of the transition that Europeans are aiming for, it is going to involve workers needing to learn new skills and being qualified to work in these new green industries of tomorrow. And that's why, apart from investing in hard infrastructure like charging stations and things like that, a lot of the money is also targeted at digitizing public administration and going to education and things like that, so that you aren't going to see the kind of skills mismatches that would hold back growth and that would keep it from happening quicker. The last point that I want to make is that for the past, 10 years longer, we've been worried a little bit about why has productivity growth been so low, and we've been worrying about this on both sides of the Atlantic. But I think that these sorts of investments in physical capital and in human capital have the potential, and the hope is that you're going to see really big productivity gains because of the green and the digital transition. The RRF is helping to push this along, but some of it's also coming from our experiences of the pandemic, that you can have these webinars. You don't necessarily need to travel to meet your clients. You can have these video meetings. There's going to be more investment in broadband and computers and cloud computing and things like that as well.
How do you explain the stark difference on the core inflation between the U.S. and Europe? What do you think drives that? Containers being on the wrong side of the United States? Is it all logistics, or where is this coming from? Where's the gap coming from?
Well, I don't think a couple of months of data are quite enough to go on. There is still this question of how much of it is driven by the supply side and how much of it is driven by the demand side. It does, you know, there was a little bit more in terms of the fiscal expansion in the United States that maybe is responsible for demand being a bit higher in the US. Savings rates were a bit higher for consumers, but I think it's really too soon to say. And I mean, I also expect US inflation figures to fall back within the next few months. So who knows? Maybe the timing of these things is working out a little bit differently.
Good. Do we want to talk a little bit about policies, policies, macroeconomic policies, monetary policy in Europe?
Maybe if we can move to slide 11 in the growth map, we can talk a little bit about what's going on here. So this just shows you for all the member states what's happening in terms of the growth that happened this year and the projection for next year. And the main point is that growth is rebounding everywhere. Every member state is seeing an expansion this year and will again next. The countries with the darker colors are expanding at the fastest rate, but that is also in part because those countries had the sharpest declines in output last year. And for the EU as a whole, as Balazs said earlier, GDP has now already returned to pre-pandemic levels, and just about every member state will have done so by the end of the year. But maybe this is a good place to say a few words about some of the largest economies. You'll note that Germany is set to record the lowest growth rate in the EU this year at 2.7%. Now, in a normal year, 2.7% wouldn't be a bad figure. And in part, the growth rate is low because the crisis was less severe in Germany, and so there's less ground to make up. But it's also because Germany is a manufacturing powerhouse, and supply shortages are having a real impact on factory output. So, but as these bottlenecks ease, as we hope and expect they will in the beginning of next year, German growth is set to rebound further, and next year we're looking at 4.6% before falling back a bit to 1.7 in 2023. Now in France, growth is forecast to hit 6.5% this year, and part of that is just this easing of pandemic-related containment measures, so people can go back out to restaurants. The tourism industry is restarting. But the country I'd really like to highlight here is Italy, because well, my boss is Italian, and he's been joking with me for years that Italy is the crouching tiger of Europe, ready to leap to new bounds of growth and innovation. And of course, it never happened until this year, right? You're going to see 6.2% growth in Italy this year, which is, I mean, an amazing figure. That's an annual year-over-year number. And again, partly this is a story of rebounding from a very bad performance last year. It's the reopening of restaurants, the tourism sector coming back. Growth is supposed to be 4.3% next year and 2.3 in 2023. And these are good numbers. And especially once you look at 22 and 23, these numbers are going to be supported by the RRF, because Italy is set to be one of the main beneficiaries of these funds. And that is going to provide a fiscal impetus to Italian growth. But also, I don't think we should forget that the government, which is led by Mario Draghi, is embarking on some very significant structural reforms, because there are conditions attached to the RRF funding. And the conditions are that you make important structural reforms that will boost the long-term potential growth and productivity of the economy. So in Italy, there's a lot of focus on reforming the judiciary and the broader legal system, making it more efficient, making court cases happen quicker. This is especially important in terms of bankruptcy proceedings and things like that. So the structural reforms should also pay dividends over the longer term. And similar things are happening in Spain, for example. Spain is set to be another one of the main beneficiaries of the RRF. You're going to have growth of 4.6% this year, 5.5% next year, also because of tourism, also because of rebounding. But in Spain, they are really focusing a lot on labor market reforms to make it more flexible, introduce more active labor market policies, reduce skills mismatches. And I should add that Spain already has some of the best physical infrastructure in Europe. So if these reforms work, if they're implemented effectively, quickly, you could really see long-term benefits in terms of productivity and potential growth, which is ultimately where wealth comes from, right?
I just want to support that. Sorry, yeah, can I just come in a little bit? So I just want to underline what Ben has just said, that for example, the recovery and resilience facility or these plans, they're not only about spending money. So that's a huge, I think is understated often, that when you see the overall figure, 800 billion euros for 6 years or whatever, that doesn't tell you half of the story, because a large part, what the Commission has, the European institutions have done, is to ask the member states to do reforms in exchange for that money. So I think a large part of the RF is all those reforms, structural reforms, that will make this chart dark colored for a longer period than just 2022. I think that's very important to emphasize, and that's going to create opportunities for the private sectors as well to jump on the bandwagon and go along with the twin transitions, the digital and green transitions. I think that's an important enabler for the private sector as well.
Yeah. We have a couple of questions from the audience, and one is related to that. And I think it's actually a really interesting question. Shouldn't the metrics of growth require that more jobs are created than lost? I mean, I think it's the pandemic was a little bit different. That this is in general true, but the pandemic was a little bit different because, like Ben said, it's a lot of people retired early. But I think it's an interesting question. What are your thoughts on that? For long-term, in terms of long-term planning, you know?
Absolutely, you absolutely need more job growth. I mean, there are some demographic issues in Europe that or everywhere that the population is aging. But I think not only do you, of course, need good job growth, but there are also measures to keep people working for longer. I mean, when pension and retirement schemes were set up, one of the reasons why they were affordable is because if you were a factory worker and you retired at 65, you might die 3 or 4 years later, and so you wouldn't be drawing on your pension scheme for that long. But now, because of people are healthier, healthcare systems are better, people are living for a long time, and that means that maybe they don't need to retire at 65. Maybe they can work a little bit longer. I don't know, Balázs, you want to add to that?
No, I just want to go back that exactly this is the reason why the EU it doesn't want the digital and green transition just to happen by itself. It doesn't want to stand back and say, okay, well, of course there are going to be new corporations, doing the digital services, and therefore they will wait until there are some people who can actually do it for them. But the EU wants to drive this. So I think that a huge part of this is to upskill and reskill the labor force. And there's this specific theme also in the RF saying that we want to upskill and reskill the labor force so they are fit for they could be employed in the new economy. I think that's a short answer because.
Yeah, we're running a little bit out of time, and we do have a survey that we could run in the background while, or a quick poll that we could get started in the background while we're answering a couple more questions from the audience. So just to stay on the job growth for a second, there's a question from our colleagues in Cincinnati. Job growth expectations should be kept in check. Many firms are constrained by lack of skilled labor and are turning increasingly to automation. Is that a concern in Europe as well?
I don't know if that's a concern as much as a benefit. I mean, people are always talking about, oh, what's going to happen when the robots take our jobs? But the fact is that a lot of automation takes very rote tasks, low-skilled tasks that are able to be automated. And what that does is it leaves, you know, higher skilled jobs available for people. So ultimately, what we should see here is big boosts in productivity if the investments in the green and digital transitions are successful, and if they you know, do create new businesses, new technologies, and new jobs for people. Now, that's not to say that people need the skills and they need to be have education and training programs that prepare them, but that is one of the main goals of the RF. And if you can, in between these polls, pull up the 14th slide, I just want to emphasize we are talking about macroeconomically significant figures in terms of the RRF. So the Commission is projecting that about 215 billion euros in grants, now not loans, just grants, these don't have to be repaid by the member states, about 215 billion euros are going to be distributed through the end of 2023. Now that is about 1.5% of GDP for the EU as a whole, but for specific countries, particularly in Southern and Eastern Europe, who are disproportionately benefiting from this money, the impact is going to be more. So you're going to see RRF grants amounting to about 5% of GDP in countries like Spain and Croatia, and in Italy it's over 2%. So this is real money that is going to, on the one hand, have a fiscal impact as it's spent, but then hopefully have a longer term benefit to human capital, skills, all this stuff that'll boost productivity in the longer run.
Yeah, true. Interesting. We have another question about that a transitionary state or not so transitionary on the supply chain challenges. The theory that one of our audience members brings up is that particularly with China, but even between Europe and the US, there's still trade and policy tensions, and that China in particular might feel freer to be more aggressive after the Winter Olympics and renew a trade war. Will that exacerbate supply chain issues?
A trade war would definitely accentuate the supply chain issues. I don't know whether there's going to be.
Are we expecting one to come?
No. I mean, that's certainly not the baseline in the forecast. There is a lot of uncertainty with this forecast. You know, there always is when you're projecting out into the future. Uncertainty might be particularly high at this point in time because we haven't gone through a pandemic like this, and we still don't know what is going to happen with the course of infections. And once you get outside of Europe and the US, vaccination rates are much lower. So who knows what could happen? That is a significant risk. But you know, you could also see one of the solutions to supply chains that have been stretched very thin is to have a reshoring of some critical industries so that they're closer to their final point of sale. Now, in the past, I think people have been worried that, you know, this would be just sort of a precursor to protectionism. And I mean, yeah, you always have to worry about that. But it's also true that it could have benefits in terms of jobs and growth, and it need not be simply a protectionist response. It could be a wise business decision to have a little bit more control over your supply chains.
Mm-hmm. What are your, without wanting to put you on the spot, I'm putting you on the spot. What are your biggest fears, you know, for, and, you know, we talked about, you know, still remaining risks. What do you think are the biggest risks that we need to watch out for and that need to be addressed?
Well, I would certainly point to COVID, and that's the key one. And I think that we can expect that you know, there's always a risk of supply chain disruptions until we've got COVID under control. globally, not just in the U.S. And I think in the longer term, what I would say is that the RRF money does need to be spent efficiently, and the member states do need to implement their structural reforms effectively. Because, I mean, some people talk about the RRF as a Hamiltonian moment for Europe, and you know, it's not exactly a Hamiltonian moment in the sense that when that deal was made in the United States in the 18th century, the federal government actually assumed the debts of some of the most indebted U.S. states. That's not what's happening here, but it is a huge step forward in terms of fiscal integration. And to the extent that it's successfully implemented, I think it bodes very well for further European integration and a stronger economy and a better standard of living. And so, what I would say is that in the short term, right, we know it's COVID, it's supply chains, it's how is inflation going to prove transitory or not. But over the medium to longer term, it's about implementing public policies effectively and not making policy mistakes. And honestly, I'm cautiously optimistic, in part because the response to the crisis has been so much more effective than if we'd been talking 10 years ago, or 8 years ago, talking about sovereign debt crises and bond spreads blowing out in Europe. That has not been happening this time. And I think there have been some lessons learned. And one more thing to add is that there is fiscal consolidation that is going to be happening in Europe, but you're not going to see this rush to austerity like was happening in the 8 years ago. There's going to be slow, steady consolidation. Policymakers don't want to choke off growth before the recovery has matured a bit more. But with that, I'll stop and see if Balázs wants to add anything.
No, I just wanted to just quickly reflect on that maybe this is not a Hamiltonian moment, but it's a big moment just as much, because as you just mentioned, that the European member states have been able to come together and put together a package which is basically unprecedented in a very, very short period of time in Brussels, where you would, when everything takes 6 to 12 months to happen, and this time around it was done very, very fast. So I think that bodes very well for the future. So just this addition.
That's very good. I am very curious to see the next report on the winter report. I think we will be talking about that in February. And I think we ran out of time, so we will make the slides available to our audience after the program. And I want to thank everybody for joining us, our panel, for sharing your insights. And interestingly enough, on the green transition, we do have a program scheduled on December 6th on the transatlantic collaboration on EV batteries and their role in the green energy transition. So do join us for that. We're also back with live events. We have a real estate update coming up on December 9th. That will be an in-person event, so I invite everybody to join us for that. My colleague Paolo will upload the recording for this event to our website. And if you're a member and you want to connect with any of the other participants, let us know. We're happy to connect you. Ben, Balázs, thank you so much for today's discussion.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.